The Thalmor are more than just another faction on Tamriel. They are a nauseating, loathsome blight on the face of Nirn. Their very existence is a perversion of everything that is good and just in the world. From their heinous policies of racial supremacy to their absurd obsession with the past, these elitist zealots have warped everything they touch, leaving nothing but wretched destruction in their wake. Oh, don't let their sharp suits and gilded masks fool you into thinking they're some kind of sophisticated power. No, they are far from it. They're a group of misbegotten fools, desperately clinging to a false sense of superiority, lashing out at the world that rejects their twisted vision of Aldmeri dominance. The very air they breathe reeks of vile ambition and despicable arrogance. You can see it in their eyes, the way they look down on every other race, as if the Aldmer were some kind of divine gift to Tamriel. Foul and dangerously deluded, but they do wield power, and that's what makes them so unsettling. Their influence stretches across the Empire, and with their control over the Aldmeri Dominion, they impose their contemptible will on every corner of the continent. But power alone does not justify their existence. No, their power is the result of their revolting methods, their blind, heartless pursuit of dominance. It is that power that must be feared, and more importantly, hated. I will begin with an anecdotal story to remind you of Merethic cruelty. To quote, "The wind howled across the barren, snow-covered road near Whiterun, biting through the furs and leathers of a lone Nord as he trudged through the storm. Ulfric was old, but the cold didn't faze him. He had faced much worse in his time. His boots crunched against the packed snow, the rhythmic sound a small comfort in the otherwise oppressive silence of the frozen landscape. But he wasn't alone. From the blizzard's haze, two figures emerged, dark shapes cutting through the white. They were unmistakable. The Thalmor. Their black and gold robes stood out like a cancerous growth against the starkness of the snow, their every movement suffused with an air of superiority, as if the very ground they walked on ought to worship them. Ulfric's blood boiled. He had seen their kind before, and it was never a meeting he'd welcome. They were loathsome, despicable. The Thalmor Justicar, tall and imperious, stepped forward with a sickening smile, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What have we here? A wretched Nord stumbling through the snow like a lost animal." Ulfric straightened himself, his old bones creaking as he stood tall despite the years weighing him down. "You're far from home, Thalmor," he spat, though his voice trembled slightly from the cold. "You've no business here." The Justicar's smile widened, and he waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, but I do, old man. You see, we are the future of Tamriel, and every last one of you is nothing but a stain on it. How unfortunate for you that you have the privilege of seeing it firsthand." Ulfric's fingers tightened around the haft of his axe, but his body was weary. He'd had many battles, many fights, but this one felt different. He was no fool. The Thalmor were powerful, their magic fierce and their conviction unshakable. "Come now, Nord. Don't make this harder on yourself." The Justicar raised his hand, and before Ulfric could react, a blast of lightning shot from his palm, striking Ulfric square in the chest. The shock was immediate and brutal, coursing through his body, seizing his muscles. The old man's legs buckled, and he collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath, his chest burning. "You still think you can resist us, don't you?" The Justicar mocked, stepping closer with slow, deliberate steps. He crouched down and grabbed Ulfric by the hair, yanking his head back to look up at him. "Your kind has always been so stubborn, so proud, but it's nothing more than a foolish death throw. Vile, really." Ulfric's head lolled to the side, blood trickling from his lips. His vision swam with spots of color as he tried to shake off the shock, but the Thalmor's grip only tightened. "You'll regret this, elf," Ulfric growled, though his voice was weak, the words barely more than a rasp. "One day, you will all fall." The Justicar chuckled darkly, as if the notion was a joke. "Foolish. You can hardly stand, and you speak of our fall. The world is changing, old man. We will crush every last one of your pitiful kind underfoot, and none of your struggles will matter. You're just a relic of the past." He raised his foot and stomped it into Ulfric's ribs, cracking bone with the force of the blow. The pain was blinding. Ulfric coughed, more blood spilling from his mouth, and for a fleeting moment he thought he might pass out. But even then, the fire inside him wouldn't die. The Thalmor could break his body, but they would never break his spirit. The Justicar, seemingly bored with the old Nord's stubbornness, lifted his boot from Ulfric's ribs. He looked down at the broken form beneath him, his lips curling in a cruel smile. "This is how it will be for all of you. One by one you will fall, and none of you will be left to resist. The wretched Nords, the weak Imperials, each of you will be crushed by the superior strength of the Aldmeri Dominion." With a final sneer, the Justicar stood, straightening his robes. "And you, old man, are nothing but an insect on the path to our glorious future." Ulfric could only watch as the Thalmor turned away, laughing softly to himself as he walked off into the blizzard, leaving Ulfric broken and bleeding in the snow. The wind howled, the cold gnawed at him, but it wasn't the frost that threatened to kill him. It was the bitter realization that the Thalmor would never stop, that their arrogance would never relent. Still, even as his body lay half-conscious on the icy ground, Ulfric clung to one truth. He was not defeated. Not yet. End quote. It should be no surprise that a faction as despicable as the Thalmor has an obsession with preserving what they consider the purity of Aldmeri bloodlines. Their fixation on keeping their race untouched by the so-called imperfections of the other races of Tamriel is not just a misguided notion of superiority, but a dangerous practice that reveals the fragility lurking beneath their pompous facade. Inbreeding is, of course, the obvious consequence of such a twisted obsession. To maintain the purity of their bloodline, the Thalmor have long been forced to intermarry, repeatedly consolidating their gene pool until it becomes little more than a puddle of fragile genetics. The very people who claim to be the pinnacle of Tamrielic civilization, the very ones who look down their noses at every other race, are plagued by physical and intellectual decay. Their own magisters, some of the most powerful and influential figures in their society, have proven to be riddled with debilitating genetic defects. These defects go beyond mere physical deformities. More troubling is the deterioration of their mental faculties, making their leaders increasingly erratic and less able to fulfill their supposed roles as rulers of Tamriel. The mindless repetition of their superiority complex, as if it's some kind of mantra, only further accelerates their internal rot. The Thalmor have created a society of sickly elites, too proud to accept the simple truth that their endless pursuit of purity is only accelerating their downfall. The more they try to perfect themselves, the more fragile they become. Their desperate attempts to sustain the illusion of strength have made them a joke. This pursuit of an illusion of purity, so deeply ingrained in the Thalmor's psyche, ultimately betrays them. The strength of the Altmer has always been their adaptability, their ability to change and grow with the times. But the Thalmor reject that. They reject evolution in favor of stagnation, clinging to the past with the desperation of a dying animal. The consequences of their obsession are far-reaching. They have not only doomed themselves, but have made the people they dominate even more vulnerable. Those who bow to the Thalmor, those who live under their oppressive regime, are forced to watch as their overlords slowly degrade, and yet they can do nothing to stop it. And it is a fate that the rest of Tamriel must ultimately watch from the sidelines, waiting for the inevitable collapse of this sick, twisted empire. What's more, the Thalmor's fashion sense is as nauseating as their politics, and it reeks of desperation. Their robes, those wretched garments of black and gold, don't just symbolize power. They scream of their desire to hide their fragility behind layers of gilded nonsense. They drape themselves in these ostentatious fabrics, desperate to make themselves appear as though they belong to some higher class of society, when in truth they are nothing more than self-important charlatans. Let's start with their color scheme. Black and gold. They think it makes them regal. It doesn't. It's an overused, tired aesthetic that reeks of insecurity. These are not the robes of an empire, but the robes of a society that fears being exposed for what it truly is. A hollow, morally bankrupt institution desperately clinging to power. They think the gold represents glory, but it's nothing more than a distraction. A shiny facade designed to cover the rot beneath. It's a vain attempt to cloak themselves in something meaningful, but all it does is highlight their ridiculous, childish pretense. Then there's the absurdity of their robes themselves. Oversized shoulder pads, too many embellishments, and intricate designs that, instead of being intimidating, make them look like theatrical props rather than rulers of an empire. They stand there, all sharp angles and flapping fabric, unable to move without drawing attention to their utter lack of practicality. They are too busy impressing their own kind with these revolting adornments to realize that the rest of Tamriel is laughing at them. They strut around like peacocks in the imperial courts, all the while forgetting that true power comes from strength of character, not the ability to wear an embroidered collar that looks like it could choke them. If you compare the Thalmor's fashion to the simple, functional attire of other Tamrielic cultures, the disparity is laughable. Nords, for example, wear practical furs and leathers suited to the harsh climate of Skyrim. They don't need to flaunt their wealth through ornate garments. They earn their respect with their actions. The Khajiit and Argonians wear what they need, designed for utility, mobility, and survival in their respective environments. And yet the Thalmor, so obsessed with projecting an image of grandeur, put themselves in clothing that is as impractical as it is absurd. Their robes say nothing about their capability and everything about their arrogance. The Thalmor's fixation on the past is more than just nostalgia. It's a destructive obsession that taints everything they touch. These self-proclaimed masters of Tamriel, with their nauseating sense of superiority, cling to a vision of Aldmeri dominance that has long since passed. It's as if they've convinced themselves that Tamriel was somehow better when their ancestors ruled, and that the only way forward is to rewind history, despite the very real, ugly consequences of trying to do so. What the Thalmor fail to understand, or more likely refuse to accept, is that the world has changed. Tamriel is no longer a realm dominated by elves, and their reign over the races of men, orcs, and beasts is a distant memory. But the Thalmor, in their delusional arrogance, refuse to acknowledge this. Instead, they chase after a golden age that only exists in their minds. The Aldmeri Dominion, the supposed golden age they yearn for, is long gone, swept away by the very elves who once ruled it. But this doesn't stop the Thalmor from trying to rekindle the fires of their imagined superiority. Their historical revisionism is horrendous. They go to remarkable lengths to whitewash the true history of the elves and rewrite it in their own image, erasing the inconvenient truths about the Aldmeri Dominion's past, including the fact that it was a brutal, oppressive regime. To the Thalmor, the truth is malleable, a tool to be bent and twisted in whatever way will serve their cause. They seek to erase the rebellions of the other races, like the Nerevarines rise against the tribunal, and paint themselves as the rightful rulers of all Tamriel, regardless of how much blood must be spilled to achieve it. The Thalmor's anti-Talos crusade is a shining example of the hypocrisy that courses through every vein of their malignant existence. At the heart of their so-called justification for their war on Talos worship lies an utterly vile contradiction. They preach about the sanctity of the Aldmeri pantheon, venerating their own divine ancestors who are no more divine than the dirt beneath their feet. And yet they seek to suppress the very faith that forged the empire they now seek to control. Talos, the once mortal god, the man who rose from the blood and grit of Tamriel's streets, is a symbol of everything the Thalmor despise. A mortal who ascended to godhood not by bloodline, not by some false claim of divinity, but through the sheer force of will, power, and the respect of his people. The Thalmor, of course, cannot tolerate this. A mere mortal ascending to godhood without divine bloodlines. Preposterous. Their fragile egos cannot handle the very idea that an ordinary man, a Nord at that, could claim divinity while they, the self-proclaimed elite of Tamriel, wallow in their pompous, self-aggrandizing delusions. So, they embark on their foul crusade, seeking to stamp out Talos worship with all the methods they can muster. Executions, surveillance, spying, and the complete eradication of any symbol of Talos's divine reign. They march into cities, cloaked in their grotesque finery, demanding the removal of Talos's statues and the burning of his shrines, their eyes burning with the fervor of their false righteousness. The audacity of it all is staggering. They seek to erase a part of Tamriel's soul, a god who has inspired countless generations of Nords and other free peoples, all in the name of maintaining their crumbling Aldmeri ideals. In the end, the Thalmor are not just a vile political force, they are a warning, a reminder of what happens when arrogance and power are allowed to run unchecked, when those who claim superiority cannot bear the weight of their own fragile egos. They are the embodiment of a sickness that infects Tamriel, a corruption that seeks to crush freedom and the very will of the people. But we are not their puppets. We never have been, and we never will be. So, the next time you hear of their despicable deeds, their revolting actions, remember this: the Thalmor's power is built on nothing more than fear and deception. And no matter how many statues they tear down, no matter how many lives they destroy, they can never break the spirit of the people. We will always resist, and in the end it is that spirit that will outlast them all.